Just quickly wanted to go over some of the winning graphic organizers that were sent in. This is Drew King's. I immediately went to this picture, this little illustration showing how both had equal citizens' rights at this point. Black man had the same equal rights as the white man. So he was one of my winners. This is Sarah Hubbard, and it might be a little blurred. It's a lot of information on this, and that's why I like this one, because she took the amendments and she summed them up in her own words. Great way to remember stuff and recall stuff. She also added how it affected African Americans. Ava Woods and Hannah Hansen, they were also winners because of their art, their pictures, their clear, distinct handwriting, very eye-catching. That was Ava's, and this is Hannah Hansborough's. So we are finished with chapter 22 and 23, which takes us to a year-end review. This U.S. History Review will start with colonization, which takes us all the way back to August. So just hang tight. I will also post this video without my comments, so you can kind of move through at your own pace to do any kind of assignment at the end. The first thing we want to talk about is why we're going to explore America. Why would we send people over? Why would England send people? Why would France send people? And Spain. Those were the three major countries sending people. Basically, if you will remember, we talked about the 3 G's a little bit in class. The 3 G's, God, glory, and gold. So let's talk about God first. Basically, Spaniards and the French, they wanted to spread Christianity, Catholicism. English, they wanted to break away from the Church of England. So they were seeking religious freedom, basically. As far as glory, that's kind of like fame. The greatness of a country is kind of based on strength and size and how much money they have. So building an early empire meant coming over, gobbling up as much land as possible and resources to help build their empire. As far as gold, they came seeking resources, gold being one of the main ones. They also wanted to find that sea route to Asia, to do some trading with spices and silk. Maybe fur trading for the French. And then the English were basically trying to get as many resources as possible, get them back to England, complete trade finished products, make a product, and then sell it as high as they could and make a profit. Now, most of you know what that's called. If you don't remember, it's called mercantilism. So that's basically where a country will take in raw materials rarely cheap and export more goods than they import, making their country very wealthy. And I believe that's the next slide actually shows an illustration of that. Most raw materials were sent over to Europe, England, and they made the finished product. Any kind of good, finished good, they brought them back over and sold them to the colonists. So, what are some other reasons for colonization in North America? Basically for better opportunities. Some people were just looking for a fresh start. Some were escaping political turmoil, upheaval. There was a lot of population growth in England, so they were coming over to kind of spread out, get their land, and make their own little empire. Religious persecution to enrich the mother country. That's why England was seeking those joint stock companies to invest in those companies and send people over in order to make money. Georgia, of course, was established down here as like a buffer because we had Florida that was full of Spaniards, and basically the buffer state of Georgia was where debtors went. People maybe going to prison could choose to settle in Georgia, and they served as a buffer to protect the other 13 colonies. So where did it all begin? The first successful permanent settlement was Jamestown. Jamestown was not a hit immediately. When we had the men to come over, most of them were gentlemen wearing suits and not used to or accustomed to hard work. So when it came to planting your own food, building your own fort, some of these men, they weren't willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and get dirty, so to speak. So luckily, they joined in with the Powhatan Indians. And the Powhatan Indians, they started kind of a little bit of a trade with them. Powhatan Indians traded food and fur for metal, shiny trinkets like metal tools, copper. And so they were able to get food from the Indians. The Indians also helped them a little bit. They helped them with that tobacco, gave them the first seeds for tobacco, or traded for the first seeds for tobacco. And that's really what saved Jamestown, tobacco. They came seeking gold, but when they landed in a very low-lying marsh area, and it was very swampy, full of mosquitoes. Dysentery, typhoid, diseases were rampant, and so very unsuccessful. The moisture, though, helped to fertilize the soil. And so when they started planting tobacco, and I have another visual for you. England loved tobacco. So when they started planting tobacco and they sent it over to England, everybody was in love with tobacco. So as more people arrived, they took more land, they encroached in on the Powhatan Indians, and then a drought occurred, which threw the colonists even more so into turmoil. The colonists resorted to stealing corn from the Powhatan Indians, and when the Powhatan Indians retaliated, they blockaded Jamestown. And so as they stayed in this fort for many, many days, starvation time occurred, and some of the colonists resorted to cannibalism. So Jamestown was not a hit. It was not easy. It was hard. But luckily, thanks to one cash crop, tobacco, it became a success. This is also the site of the first representative body in the colonies. It's referred to as the Virginia House of Burgesses. It's where 22 representatives basically helped to govern and make decisions for the colony. This also began that long conflict with American Indians. So when we talk about the groups seeking religious freedom, we've got to focus on the two main groups. I made you a little Venn diagram, Pilgrims and Puritans. So let's talk about the Pilgrims first. Pilgrims were separatists, and separatists basically because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. They came over to completely break away from the Church of England. Remember, the king, he wanted a divorce. Church wouldn't grant him a divorce, so he kind of started doing his own thing, and they felt they needed to pull away. They landed in 1620 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their leader was William Bradford. They were not a wealthy group, and they were not a large group. They came over on the Mayflower, and before coming, or before leaving the Mayflower, they made a Mayflower Compact, which is so significant. It's our first written plan for a democratic government. It's where they basically agreed to keep order, to elect officers, to vote on laws, to set up a self-government. And so this is the first time really when, we're over in America, we're starting to do things for ourselves. Somewhere around 100 passengers on that Mayflower when they came over, where most of them died that first winter due to starvation. The Wampanoag Indians taught them how to fish and farm. Remember in science class, they taught them how to take that fish and cut it up and fertilize the soil, put the seed in. That's Squanto from the Wampanoag Indians. So that is the reason we have that Thanksgiving, which started in 1621. Now the other group is the Puritans. Puritans were non-separatists. They were basically reformers. They believed that the Church of England was the one true church. They believed in theocracy where the priests ruled the government. And they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to tear it apart, the Church of England, destroy it. They just wanted to reform it, to change it. They landed 1630 in Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were the less radical group out of the two, just wealthier. They basically came over with about 17 ships, 1,000 or more people, and they had money and resources. So leaving England, they could create the idea of the English church over here their own way, with the leader of John Winthrop. And his philosophy was the city on the hill where people and God always looked up to them and admired them. So a little bit different between the two. Some people say that the Pilgrims are Puritans because they're both pulling away from the church. One wanted to separate completely, that'd be the Pilgrims. The Puritans, they just wanted to reform it. All right, so when we talk about the areas out of the 13 colonies, we're going to break them up geographically. The first area would be the New England colonies, which is further up north. So the climate is very cold. You've got lots of trees. That's a deciduous forest. So you've got a lot of evergreens, lots of acid going into the soil. So not fertile soil, but rocky soil, not good for planting. So what you depended on mostly in this area, lumbering, you had the trees from the forest, fishing, whaling, whale oil. Later on became a very big manufacturing area. As far as education, it was based on that Bible, Puritan and Pilgrims. As far as the middle colonies, a very, very high tolerant area. I like to think of the middle starting with an M, and I think of a mix. It's just a mixture of different European people coming over. Tolerant. Everybody was accepted. I mean, think about William Penn, who received Pennsylvania through a debt that the king owed his father. It was just a safe haven for anybody, any religious belief. And they even were huge allies and friends with the Indians. They did fair trading with them. They treated them equal. Those middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, we still think of them as northern states, but those are referred to as the middle colonies. And the middle colonies served as the breadbasket. They grew grains, wheats, oats, and it's because of their mild, temperate temperatures. Southern colonies, you and I know, are mostly made up of plantations. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And you know this because we've already talked about the Civil War. So the plantation system, that's large cash crops, tobacco, rice, and indigo. Basically, one end of the spectrum to the other. So we had slaves, laborers, and then we had those wealthy planters. We had the warmer temperatures because we're closer to the equator, so we had a longer growing season. And growth of representative government. So a few of the leading factors that led us to make representative government started with the distance from Great Britain. I put you a little image over here to help. So what happens when you show up at camp and you forgot to pack your pillow? Well, you take a coat or a sweater or sweatshirt and you wad it up and you make your own pillow. So that's what we started. The distance from our leadership just helped us or pushed us to create our own legislative bodies, our own government. So the distance, the time it took to send messages over to our leaders in England, get a response back, it was just difficult. So we just started standing on our own 2 feet, creating our own legislative bodies. Salutary neglect, that's basically where they allowed us to do our thing without bothering us. Great Britain and England, they just ignored us as long as we were making them money. The First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment period, that's the first revival that basically opened everyone's eyes up to God. Basically said you can have a personal relationship without that church doctrine, and one-on-one, everybody's equal. The success of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is that house, that government body with 22 representatives, it spread into other colonies. So it was kind of the beginnings of self-government forming in other colonies. 2 huge documents, the Mayflower Compact, again, that was our first democratic government, our first movement towards a democratic government. So thinking about everybody within the colony and making fair and just laws. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, that's when Thomas Hooker went against the Puritan belief that you had to be a male that owned land in order to vote. And he said, no, all men should be able to vote. So he not only was the father of Connecticut, but he became known as the father of American democracy. And together, these groups, along with the people who kind of showed resistance, along with some of those acts like the Maryland Toleration Act, where we're trying to separate our government and our church, those all lead to our First Amendment, which is the protection of freedom of religion. So we can't leave the colonization era without speaking of slavery. Slavery, Jamestown supposedly had slaves to help with the tobacco. And where did those slaves come from? Well, we created what we call a transatlantic triangular trade. This is a three-leg between 13 colonies, England, and Africa. So we, in the 13 colonies, would send raw materials over to England. England would make finished products or goods and send them on a ship down to Africa. Trade those goods for slaves. Slaves would then be taken over to the Caribbean islands or the 13 colonies. So the worst of these three legs, we'll say, routes, would be the Middle Passage, which is from Africa over to North America. Conditions were horrible and cruel on those boats. Most of them did not even make it due to disease, hunger, and so terrible conditions on those boats. I showed a video, and it is on YouTube if you would like to look that up. It is, I think it's just called the Middle Passage. Ending the colonial era, we're talking about the French and Indian War. So as we're starting to gobble up our land, we tend to break out into a fight between France, and I say we being British American colonies. So we're fighting on Britain's side. This is a war between Britain and France, not the French and the Indian, but we are fighting, as far as British Americans, we are fighting the French. So what we're mainly fighting over is that Ohio River Valley. We win, and our mother country's proud. However, we put our mother country into debt. That's when Britain decides to tax us. They levy taxes to pay off their war debt. And we don't have a voice in these taxes. That's where our taxation without representation comes from. And it angers us. Not only do we start getting taxed to pay off the war debt, but we're told that there is a line right here, and this line is called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and it forbids any colonist from traveling over into the Ohio River Valley and settling this territory. Why? Because we're going to give it to the Indians, so to keep peace and keep them kind of settled and quiet. So colonial people, just colonists, resent this, and they pass over, and that leads us down another road in the near future of maybe some fighting. What other effects did we have from the French and Indian War? Well, we learned to unify ourselves. That's when Benjamin Franklin came out with this political cartoon with the segmented snake that says join or die. The segments represent the colonies, and broken apart, we're not powerful. Together, we can take on us, and we're a strong force, basically. Colonial leaders like George Washington, they gain experience, and that will help us in wars to come. Okay, I'm going to assign you 2 assignments and give you instructions on the website. I'll also post this website, or this PowerPoint without my comments so that you can go through it slowly. But that's the Colonial Era Review.